Search and video today, we're diving into the Battle of Midway, a turning point of World War II. But our story isn't merely about military strategy and brutal combat. It's about the shadow war of code breaking the cryptologists, the unsung heroes armed, with knowledge and intuition, played an essential role in securing victory. So join us as we journey back to 1942 through the murky depths of deception and intelligence to uncover how the Battle of Midway was won, not just on the seas and in the skies, but also within the cryptic world of coded messages as the mighty aircraft carrier fleet of the Japanese Navy advanced towards Midway Atoll on the morning of June 4, 1942. They were unknowingly heading into a trap laid by 3U. This strategic placement of the American fleet wasn't coincidental, as the U.S. Navy's Codebreakers had successfully intercepted and deciphered Japanese radio signals, thereby allowing Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz to catch the Japanese by surprise at Midway. This intelligence coup is now widely recognized despite the secrecy around U.S. communications intelligence during World War II. The role of codebreakers in revealing Japanese plans for Midway was first alluded to by journalist Stanley Johnston in a newspaper article published shortly after the battle. Although thousands of military and civilian hook and framing, your opening is good. I'd suggest leading with a vivid contrast. Fleets clashing in the Pacific, but another war was being fought in basements, between men and ciphers. That amps up the tension. Place the code breaking early in the narrative structure. It's not just a twist, but a central pillar. Make sure viewers understand from the start. Midway was shaped as much by mathematics and silence as by planes and steel. 2. Clarify the intelligence process. Introduce Station HYPO, Pearl Harbor, and Joseph Rochefort as central actors. Their team in Hawaii was key to breaking the Japanese naval code, JN-25, and producing estimates of where AF was, Midway. Military history. Now +1, explain the AF-Midway trap more clearly. The U.S. asked Midway to send an unencrypted message saying their freshwater system was broken. When Japanese signals later referred to AF short on water, it confirmed to U.S. cryptanalysts that AF meant Midway, emphasized that decrypts didn't give perfect minute-by-minute knowledge. They were fragmentary, partial clues and corrections over time. The Americans still had to make judgment calls and risk. Refining. The journalistic leak subplot, Stanley Johnston. Your mention of Stanley Johnston is compelling. Historically, he published a Tribune story on June 6, 1942, suggesting the U.S. Navy had advanced knowledge of the Japanese plan. National Security Agency, +3navyhistory.org, National Security Archive +3, but this leak triggered internal crisis. The Navy nearly prosecuted him under the Espionage Act, but backed off partly because prosecuting would expose code-breaking secrets. National Security Archive +1, there's ambiguity about exactly how Johnston got hold of the Nimitz dispatch. One account says it was overheard or seen among survivors on the Barnett, connected with Commander Seligman, former Lexington XO, who may have had access. National Security Archive +2 navyhistory.org +2 use this subplot to highlight a theme: the tension between secrecy needed for victory and freedom of the press, and the risk of leaks blowing an advantage. Simplify and heighten dramatic moments when describing the date orders, launches, and signal decrypts. Break them into short, punchy sentences. For example, on May 31st, Nimitz sent a dispatch to his commanders, coded, but based on what HYPO had pieced together. He listed the Japanese task force and its intended target, Midway. Use timestamps, e.g. 0430 070 1022, to orient viewers in the unfolding morning. Visualize the cognitive tension in Nagumo's mind: rearming versus launching, risk of exposing decks, uncertainty of scouting reports. Tie intelligence and battlefield causality explicitly. You want to show not only that the Americans broke Japanese codes, but how that fact rippled into decisions that changed the battle. Some links to highlight decrypt our intelligence output. Decision-enabled battlefield effect identification of AF ITERS Midway. Nimitz committed carriers to the East U.S. carriers lay in a trap order of battle estimates U.S. task forces were placed precisely. Dive bombers found Japanese carriers in a vulnerable state timing estimates. expected attack date. Allowed U.S. forces to conserve fuel, planes. Fighters and planes were available when needed, continuous. Signal traffic analysis confirmed Japanese ships' positions and movements. U.S. scouts intercepted, attacked, diverted. Closing takeaway end with a reflection on how Midway remains a model of intelligence-driven warfare. The physical destruction of carriers was the visible moment, but without the silent war of cryptology and calculus, it might not have happened. You could also reflect on how secrecy around code breaking persisted for decades. The word magic was a U.S. code name for signals intelligence operations before parts were declassified. Refined script draft. The human codebreakers. Segment by the end of World War II, thousands of personnel were involved in America's radio intelligence network. But in the early months of 1942, the task of cracking Japan's naval codes fell to a select few, a small cadre of men and women whose patience and intellect accomplished what seemed impossible. Despite the popular image of whirring machines, doing the work, most of the critical code breaking at the time was done entirely by hand. The Imperial Japanese Navy relied not on mechanical encryption devices, but on manual book-based codes, dense tables of words, numbers, and transpositions designed to mask operational communications. Refined segment. The pain of precision. They began to spot recurring number sequences, fragments of logic hidden in chaos. Through painstaking comparison, they started recognizing patterns, drawing on their deep understanding of Japanese naval protocols, strategic habits, and the language itself. These code breakers didn't just translate numbers, they interpreted intentions. Every clue, every anomaly was weighed against what they knew of Japanese procedure. It demanded total focus, an almost inhuman level of attention to the smallest details. Historian David Kahn, in his landmark 1996 book The Codebreakers, called "Quite the most excruciating, exasperating, agonizing mental process known to man. Progress came in inches, not leaps. Each small triumph, decoding a single code group, a cluster of digits representing a word or phrase, was painstakingly logged and shared with other analysts working on different fragments. There were no dramatic eureka moments, no sudden breakthroughs that cracked a message wide open. Instead, there was the grind, long days of frustration, broken only by the slow realization that, piece by piece, the enemy's secrets were being pried open. Refined segment. The miracle of intelligence. However, the effort was not in vain. The victories at the Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 came at a moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy held every advantage, in ships, in tactics, in experience. Yet, against those odds, the U.S. Navy triumphed. Their secret weapon wasn't firepower. It was information, the invisible edge provided by intercepted messages, code breaking, traffic analysis, direction finding, and intelligence synthesis. What began as a small, understaffed, underfunded, and overlooked branch of naval operations had, by mid-1942, evolved into one of the most decisive instruments of war. This transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The roots of that miracle reached back to the First World War, the first great conflict to be fought across the airwaves. Before America entered the war, the United States had no organization capable of intercepting or decoding foreign radio traffic. When it joined the fight in 1917, the U.S. Army created its first code-breaking office almost overnight. The Navy, however, relied on the expertise of the British Royal Navy, which already had a formidable intelligence operation. It wasn't until the final months of the war that American naval officers began to see the immense potential of signals intelligence and started laying the groundwork for what would become their most powerful unseen weapon in the next global conflict. Refined segment. Secrets in the shadows. The Navy soon took its first small step into the secret world of code breaking. In the early 1920s, it quietly allocated $100,000 to a clandestine account within the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, funds earmarked for what they called special research. In reality, it was money set aside for future code breaking and covert operations. But surprisingly, America's first great victory in cryptology didn't come from the Navy or the Army. It came from a little-known organization formed in 1919, the U.S. Cipher Bureau, a joint project of the State and War Departments. Under the brilliant leadership of Herbert O. Yardley, the Bureau achieved what seemed impossible. After a year of painstaking work, Yardley's team cracked Japan's primary diplomatic code, giving the United States a decisive edge during the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference of 1921-1922. For the first time, American negotiators knew exactly what their Japanese counterparts were planning. Diplomacy had become a game of open cards, at least for one side. The Navy benefited immensely from this revelation, but it didn't immediately rush to build its own code-breaking branch. There were, it believed, faster and more direct methods to uncover Japan's secrets. By 1920, funds from the Oni's secret account were being used for a string of clandestine break-ins, operations straight from the pages of a spy novel. Agents quietly entered the Japanese consulate in New York City, photographing sensitive documents and copying code books. Then, in 1923, came an even bolder success. Navy. Operatives stole a Japanese naval codebook from the luggage of a visiting Japanese officer, a coup that would provide American cryptanalysts with critical insight into Japan's naval communication systems for years to come. Refined segment. The quiet architects of victory. The Navy seized on its newfound opportunity. Building on stolen codebooks and scattered experience, it set up a modest code-breaking section, a small, secretive unit tasked with exploiting what had been learned and pushing further into the world of foreign ciphers. From these dubious beginnings, America's naval cryptologic capability began to take shape. Through the 1920s and 1930s, this tiny branch slowly expanded. Its progress was measured not in leaps, but in persistence, and within its ranks were figures who would later become legends. Among them was Agnes Meyer Driscoll, known to her peers simply as Madame X. A brilliant mathematician and linguist, Driscoll trained nearly every major naval codebreaker of the coming war. Her patience, precision, and unyielding intellect laid the foundation for everything that followed. Then there was Joseph J. Rochefort, the sharp-minded officer whose intuition and analytical genius would one day uncover Japan's plans at Midway. Together with Lieutenant Commander Lawrence F. Safford, who championed the organization's growth, they began transforming a handful of enthusiasts into a coordinated cryptologic force. Under their guidance, the Navy established a network of radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Operators listened to the ether, recording and relaying fragments of Japanese communications back to Washington for analysis. Refined segment. The foundations of naval intelligence. Despite legal and financial obstacles, by the mid-1930s, the U.S. Navy had quietly built the most sophisticated cryptologic division in the American military. Under the leadership of Lawrence F. Safford and Joseph J. Rochefort, the Navy formalized its efforts into a three-pronged intelligence program: direction finding, traffic analysis, and cryptanalysis, the art and science of breaking codes. This network was directed from Navy headquarters in Washington, D.C., but its reach extended across the Pacific. Dedicated radio intelligence stations at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines monitored Japanese transmissions day and night, feeding a steady stream of intercepted signals back to analysts on the mainland. To strengthen their understanding of the enemy, the Navy dispatched promising young officers to Japan on 3-year assignments. There, they immersed themselves in the language, observed naval customs, and studied Japanese military culture firsthand. That knowledge would soon prove invaluable, helping these officers read not just the words of Japan's messages, but the intentions hidden between the lines. Refined segment. An unappreciated science. In the years before the war, cryptanalysis was not seen as a path to promotion. For many in the Navy's upper ranks, code breaking was a technical curiosity, not the stuff of command or glory at sea. This mindset made it difficult to attract and retain talented officers. Even Joseph J. Rochefort, who spent much of the 1930s mastering the Japanese language and perfecting his cryptanalytic craft, was routinely reassigned to sea duty to ensure a well-rounded career profile. The same pattern held for many others. Skilled cryptanalysts were often pulled away from their work just as they were beginning to make progress, victims of a system that valued tradition over specialization. Yet, despite this institutional short-sightedness, the Navy's small cryptologic community persevered. Through the 1920s and 1930s, they built the intellectual and technical foundations that would later prove decisive in the Pacific. As tensions with Japan escalated in the late 1930s, and especially after Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, those foundations began to expand rapidly. By the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had transformed its once-overlooked communications intelligence operation into a weapon ready to meet the storm that was coming. Refined segment, the listening web. By the early 1940s, the U.S. Navy had quietly woven a vast web of ears across the Pacific. Its communications intelligence structure included listening stations in Guam, the Philippines, Oahu, and even Washington State. Scattered across the region, a chain of high-frequency direction-finding stations triangulated the origin of Japanese radio traffic with remarkable precision. At the center of this network stood the Navy's radio intelligence hubs, one at Pearl Harbor, another at Cavite Naval Station in the Philippines, and a third in Washington, D.C. The Washington unit coordinated efforts across the Pacific, while analysts in Pearl Harbor and Cavite worked in near-constant communication, sharing intercepts and decoding progress. This cooperation extended beyond American shores. U.S. intelligence officers exchanged critical information with a British radio intelligence group based in Singapore, linking two empires of codebreakers in a shared struggle to read the enemy's thoughts. For a time, the collaboration functioned seamlessly. The stations at Cavite, Pearl Harbor, and Washington formed a triad of coordination and ingenuity, their combined insights giving the U.S. Navy a growing edge in the intelligence war. Later, personality clashes and bureaucratic rivalries would fracture that harmony. Joseph Rochefort, the man who would later help win the Battle of Midway, was even sidelined for a year, reassigned to command a floating dry dock. But in the crucial months between Pearl Harbor and Midway, that harmony still held. By late 1941, the Cavite station in Manila had grown to nearly 70 officers and enlisted personnel. At Pearl Harbor, Rochefort commanded a team of roughly 100 men, their days and nights consumed by the relentless hum of intercepted signals, messages that would soon reveal the key to one of the greatest naval victories in history. Refined segment, the invisible signals. The majority of personnel at these stations were assigned to direction finding and traffic analysis, leaving only a small handful dedicated to the painstaking work of actual code breaking. As tensions between the United States and Japan escalated in 1940 and 1941, the Navy's best window into Japan's military posture came not from deciphered messages, but from the silent patterns of its radio traffic. Traffic analysis lay at the heart of radio intelligence. It was the art of extracting meaning from an enemy's transmissions without ever breaking the code itself. Analysts dissected every fragment of data, the sender and receiver, the volume and timing of messages, the relationships between transmitters, even the rhythms of communication that mirrored past operations. From these clues, they could infer everything from fleet movements to operational readiness, sometimes weeks before a single shot was fired. Supporting them was a sprawling network of highly sensitive direction-finding antennas positioned across the Pacific. These listening posts could detect Japanese transmissions from thousands of miles away, then determine the exact bearing of the source. When two or more DF stations caught the same signal, technicians could cross their bearings, tracing invisible lines across the ocean that converged on the transmitter's location. With enough intercepts, the U.S. Navy could map the movement of entire fleets without reading a single word of the messages they sent. Refined segment, cracking the codes. While direction finding and traffic analysis provided invaluable clues, they could never match the deep revelations offered by code breaking, the power to see directly into the enemy's plans. That quest had begun years earlier. Thanks to the theft of a Japanese codebook in 1923, the U.S. Navy had gained a crucial foothold in understanding Japan's communications. The intercepted system became known as the Red Code, named after the color of the book's binding. By the mid-1930s, American cryptanalysts had unraveled much of red, exposing the inner workings of Japan's naval communications network. When the Japanese replaced it with a refined version, the Blue Code, Navy cryptologists leveraged their earlier discoveries to crack that one as well. By 1939, the United States had successfully broken the Blue Code, along with several lesser systems used for weather, shipping, and harbor operations. But an even greater challenge lay ahead. In late 1940, a joint team of U.S. Navy and Army codebreakers achieved a historic breakthrough. They cracked Japan's main diplomatic cipher, a machine-based system codenamed Purple. Unlike the manual red and blue codes, Purple relied on a complex electromechanical device that scrambled messages through an intricate pattern of rotors and switches. Amazingly, American cryptanalysts, without ever seeing the original machine, deduced its structure entirely through mathematical reasoning and thousands of intercepted messages. In time, they even built a fully functional replica, capable of stripping away the encryption layer by layer. This triumph opened a rare window into Japan's diplomatic communications. Yet, as valuable as Purple was, it wasn't used for military operations. That realm, the heart of Japan's naval power, was protected by an even tougher system, JN-25. How manual code-breaking of JN-25 really worked. What they started with, the raw inputs, intercepted radio traffic arrived as streams of 5-digit groups, e.g. 42156-00312-88724, logged by listening stations across the Pacific. Each group was a code group, a number standing for a word, phrase, letter, number. The Japanese codebook had 33,000 such groups. Those groups were super encrypted. Each 5-digit code group had a random 5-digit additive from a separate additive book of 30,000 numbers added to it before transmission. So the transmitted group Kurpars, code group plus additive, mod 10,000, or equivalent scheme. So every intercepted group was essentially a scrambled pair. To read it, you first had to undo the additive. Cataloging, indexing, and teamwork, the foundation. Meticulous logs. Every intercepted message was recorded with time, transmitter call sign, receiving station, frequency, and context. These logs were the raw database. Index cards, ledgers. Analysts maintained giant catalogs of intercepted groups and where when they occurred. Repeated occurrences were flagged, shifted teams and specializations. Some people did interception, DF. Some did traffic analysis, others did the actual cryptanalysis, subtracting additives, spotting repeats, and linguists prepared likely plaintexts for testing. Communication among these groups was constant and disciplined. Traffic analysis and direction finding, prioritization. Even before decrypting, traffic analysts could infer who was talking to whom, which nets were active, surge patterns, movement, or operation about to start, and which transmitter stations were likely Fleet HQ. DF direction finding triangulated transmitters, very important to connect a message with a fleet location. This let cryptanalysts prioritize certain traffic, e.g., a transmitter near the marshals sending high volume, or probably a task force. 4. Exploiting operator mistakes and depths, JN-25 was secure when used perfectly. The cryptanalysts relied on operator errors and statistical quirks, repeated additives or reuse of the same additive page across different messages produced. A depth. 2 different ciphertext groups that share the same additive allow subtraction between ciphertexts to eliminate the additive and reveal relationships between code groups. Message duplication. The same plain text sent twice with the same additive leaks direct information. Cribs. Known phrases. Standard naval phrasing, weather reports, and repeated operational formulae, e.g., headings, attack, landing. Supply words gave educated guesses to test against observed patterns. 5. Subtracting the additive, the core manual math. Suppose you intercept 2 5-digit groups at the same message position on 2 messages that use the same additive, a depth. Subtracting one intercepted number from the other cancels the additive and gives the difference of the underlying code groups. Repeating this across many depths yields equations relating unknown code groups. Over time, these relations let analysts cluster groups that appear consistently together or in predictable grammatical spots, e.g., verbs versus place names. This is painstaking arithmetic, repeated thousands of times, done by human calculators, and later aided by mechanical tabulators. 6. Building a working dictionary, reconstructing the codebook. As patterns and relations accumulated, analysts assigned candidate meanings to certain code groups, e.g., XXXX, attack, YYY, transport, or a place name. They then tested those hypotheses by seeing if substituting those meanings into other messages produced grammatically and operationally sensible sentences. Over time, these confirmable assignments grew into a partial codebook, a lookup index that let them translate substantial portions of many messages. Handling the additives problem in practice, the additive book changed periodically, so did the codebook. To keep up, analysts collected many messages and looked for additive reuse and patterns of digits that resembled additive sequences, constructed tables of candidate additives versus ciphertext, then tried subtracting candidate additives to produce plausible code group numbers, maintained rolling catalogs of likely code groups and additives, updated hourly, daily. The crucial role of cribs and experimental tests. Cribs are guessed plain texts. HYPO's team used likely text, e.g., place names, arrive, attack, at dawn, fuel, water status, and subtracted those guesses from intercepted groups to derive likely additives or code group entries. The famous AF water test is a classic. HYPO had a hypothesis that AF was Midway. They arranged for the Midway base to broadcast an unencrypted message that its fresh water evaporators were broken. Shortly after, intercepts contained messages that a certain task force was short of water, confirming AF either Midway. That confirmation converted partially solved code groups into reliable intelligence. Traffic plus decrypted fragments, DOC's operational picture. Once HYPO had partial translations, e.g. numbers for troops, landing, transport, AF, and unit identifiers, traffic analysis in DF tied those words to likely units and locations. Decrypts showed timing, composition, and movement. How many transports, whether carriers were with the force, launch schedules, and approach bearings. Those are the things an admiral needs to position carriers for interception. Institutional. Processes that made it reliable, redundancy of checks. Every new codebook entry was cross-checked by independent analysts and tested against other messages. Rapid update cycles. When the Japanese changed additives or codebooks, HYPO quickly reran their routines on the newest traffic to rebuild the partial dictionaries. Close liaison with operational commanders. Rochefort and his team communicated findings, with caveats, to Nimitz and staff so the admiral could make risk-balanced decisions. Why it took so long and why manual work mattered. The process is not a single eureka moment. It's thousands of small insights, arithmetic reductions, and tests stacked over months. Machines, tabulators, could help count and collate, but human, pattern recognition, intuition about language and naval practices, and clever experiments, like the Midway water trick, were decisive. The Americans didn't need to read every line of every message. They needed the right items. Who's attacking where, when, and with what? And JN-25 decrypts, even partial, provided exactly that. How those methods culminated at Midway in spring 1942, HYPO had recovered enough of JN-25's vocabulary and additives to identify references to a place labeled AF in invasion context messages. Use the water test to confirm AF, Harch, Midway. Read subsequent messages about invasion shipping. Dates and approach, carrier troop composition and timing were partially recoverable. Nimitz therefore knew where, Midway, roughly when, and enough of what to place 3 carriers in ambush rather than respond defensively. That intelligence let U.S. forces time their launches and conserve high-altitude fighter cover, producing the window of vulnerability Nagumo's force experienced, deck chaos, wrong bombs, fighters down low, that American dive bombers exploited. Short, concrete summary, what mattered most, massive interception effort. Continuous streams of 5-digit groups, Meticulous record-keeping and team organization produced an ever-growing database. Operator errors and depths let analysts cancel additives and relate code groups. Cribs, linguistic skill, and hypothesis testing let analysts assign meanings to code groups. Traffic analysis in DF tied decrypted fragments to real-world ships and locations. Clever. Experiments, the AF water test, closed the final. Uncertainty. The result. Nimitz could position his carriers to ambush the Japanese, and Midway was won. Setup. Tiny example codebook and additives that gives a numeric relation between code groups. If you can guess one code group, a crib, in the pair, you recover the other. In large operations, analysts hunt for those depths and repeated phrases to bootstrap a growing partial codebook exactly the way Rochefort's team did. Nice passage. That's basically Rochefort's method boiled down. Patience. Brute force alignment, pattern hunting, and arithmetic checks. I'll explain the procedure step by step and then show a short, concrete numeric demonstration with the digit-by-digit arithmetic of the key moves you describe. Aligning messages, hypothesizing an additive, subtracting it, and using the divisible by 3 check to validate a guess. How Rochefort's staring method worked. Overview. Collect and align intercepted messages were transcribed into columns on large sheets of paper. Analysts tried many alignments. Slide one message left. Align different columns beneath others, looking for repeated number sequences or identical groups in the same column positions across messages. Find depths, repeated additives. 2 messages use the same additive sequence, same starting point in the additive book. The additive cancels when you subtract the 2 ciphertexts. That gives a relation between the underlying code groups. C1, C2, R, CJ1, CJ2, ADD. Cancels. These relations reduce the unknowns and produce candidate numeric patterns. Hypothesize. Additives dart test candidates analysts would guess an additive or a code group and subtract it from ciphertext groups. The Japanese procedure included an error check, the divisible by 3 check you referenced. Valid plain code groups often satisfied that checksum rule, so if the subtraction result was divisible by 3, that supported the guess. In practice, there were multiple consistency checks beyond a single mod test. Bootstrap codebook entries, cribbing. Once you get a credible numeric result, a plausible code group, you try to map it to a likely word phrase, a crib, using contextual knowledge, unit names, place names, operational verbs, message conventions. If the crib fits other messages and produces consistent results, it's promoted to a confirmed entry and used to decode more messages. Iterate and expand confirmed code groups let you decode additional messages, revealing more repeated phrases and more opportunities to discover additives and codebook entries. The work is cumulative. A tiny worked example, digit by digit, showing the core moves. This is a toy example to illustrate the arithmetic and the divisible by 3 check. Real JN25 was vastly larger and messier, but the arithmetic logic is the same. Work it out carefully, right-left with borrow, .units. 2, 3, need to borrow. Borrow 1 from tens place 0, but tens is 0, so cascade borrow from hundreds, 0. Thousands, 7, 10,000, 6. After proper borrows, the subtraction yields 0.789, as you can verify with standard subtraction. We can show partial borrow steps if you want explicit per-digit borrow cascades. Add the digits of 12789, 1 plus 2 plus 7 plus 8 plus 9, sure 27. 27 is divisible by 3, so 12789. Mod 3 ordinzo. If the Japanese error check required groups to be divisible by 3, this is a consistency pass. Our candidate additive produced a plausible plain group. If the subtraction had produced a number not divisible by 3, that would argue against this additive guess. Step 4. Try to map 12789 to a likely word, crib. Using context, we know the fleet is operating. Possible words midway, carrier, squadron, attack, etc. The analyst tests whether 12789 could correspond to a known place, a word from prior guesses, or traffic analysis. If it fits and decrypting other messages with that mapping yields consistent plaintext, the team adopts the mapping. Why this is so tedious and yet so powerful? Tedium. Thousands of messages, many alignments, lots of rejected guesses, Rochefort's staring, or a huge manual pattern search. Every candidate requires subtraction, borrow arithmetic, and consistency checks. Power. A single confirmed code group or correctly identified additive produces cascades of new decodes. Depths multiply information. The additive reuse mistakes by operators made this possible. Context and intuition. Knowledge of Japanese message conventions, likely place names, unit designations, and the rhythms of naval ops let cryptanalysts generate plausible cribs. That human intuition at the end of the arithmetic chain was crucial. Short summary checklist of Rochefort's process: gather as many ciphertexts as possible. Despite these daunting setbacks, the cryptanalysts persevered. Each time the Japanese introduced new codebooks or additive tables, the Navy's codebreakers essentially had to begin from scratch, rebuilding their database of known groups, reestablishing patterns, and rediscovering relationships among messages. Progress was often painstakingly slow, measured not in days or weeks but in months of trial and error. Still, every small breakthrough mattered. Identifying even one additive or one recurring code group could unlock a cascade of insights, enabling the team to decipher portions of other messages that used the same sequences. Over time, as fragments of messages were decoded and cross-referenced, a broader picture began to form. Patterns in language use, message structure, and transmission timing all provided valuable clues about Japanese intentions and operations. In this way, the Navy's cryptanalysts, through persistence, collaboration, and ingenuity, gradually transformed the overwhelming complexity of JN-25 into actionable intelligence. Their collective effort, driven by equal parts mathematical rigor and creative intuition, would eventually culminate in one of the most significant intelligence triumphs of the Second World War, the breakthrough that made victory at Midway possible. Nice. That passage nails the grind, the teamwork, and the tiny sparks that add up to big breakthroughs. Here's a tight, usable synthesis you can drop into a script, article, caption, or teach with. It preserves the technical detail and highlights the human network that broke JN-25 and won Midway. How U.S. cryptanalysts actually broke JN-25 in plain steps. The problem? Why JN-25 was hard. JN-25 used 3 protection layers. A large codebook of 5-digit groups, 33,000 entries. B, a stream of random numeric additives added to each group from a separate table. And C, the transmitter's starting point in the additive book. Intercept, Morse, columns of 5-digit numbers. To read a message, you had to remove the additive. You needed the additive values, and then look up the resulting group in the codebook. Both the additive table and codebook periodically changed. The workflow. Assembly line cryptanalysis interception teams at multiple stations collected thousands of messages: Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO, Cavite, Washington, Guam, etc. Direction finding, DF, and traffic analysis told analysts who was talking, when and how much, even before decoding. That provided context and likely recipients. Messages were transcribed into columns and compared side by side to spot repeated sequences, formatting quirks, and pattern breaks. The detective tools and techniques, pattern spotting, statistical work. Line up many messages to find recurring number sequences. Test hypotheses about additives by subtracting candidate additives and checking for valid group structure. The Japanese error check, a divisibility by 3, helped. Cribbing, informed guessing. Use knowledge of Japanese naval routine, place names, message phrasing, and context to guess likely words, e.g., anchorage, refuel, place names. Replace suspected code groups with those guesses and see if other parts of messages become coherent. Traffic analysis and DF as force multipliers. Knowing a transmitter's location, the intended receiver, or the unit-type-focused linguistic cracking effort on likely phrases, e.g., an amphibious task force will use certain words. Meticulous record-keeping. Catalogs of identified code groups and additives were shared across centers. Each tiny identification made future decoding easier. The social mechanism. Collective, not solitary. Decoding was a cooperative, cumulative process. One person might spot a numeric repeat, another supply a contextual crib from recent operations, a third verify against DF bearings. Together, they opened a cluster that would unlock other messages. Small breakthroughs snowballed. Identify an Additive, reveal a code group, map a phrase across many messages, deduce operational intent. 5. The decisive trick at Midway HYPO, Joseph Rochefort's team, suspected the target in intercepted JN-25 traffic was AF. They set a simple test: have Midway send an unencrypted message that its potable water evaporator had broken. The Japanese. Message reporting that AF was short of water confirmed AF $Midway. That confirmed both interpretation and timing, allowing Nimitz to position carriers to ambush the Kido Butai. Outcome and significance. The decrypted intelligence didn't replace tactics and bravery, but it changed the strategic where and when. It allowed the U.S. to concentrate force at Midway and stage an ambush. Breaking JN-25 required a mix of mathematics, linguistics, domain knowledge, naval procedures, and above all, patient teamwork across multiple centers. Short takeaways: you can use verbatim cracking. JN-25 was not a eureka single hero moment. It was a distributed, iterative process of pattern recognition, educated guesses, cribs, traffic analysis, and careful record keeping. Direction finding and traffic analysis narrowed the field. Human cryptanalysts provided the intuition and language skill to turn numbers into meaning. The water test at Midway is the clearest example of how a small intelligence experiment converted ambiguous signals into actionable confirmation. The use of early data processing machines, punchers, sorters, and tabulators, helped speed up the immense workload. Once the additive layer was stripped from an intercepted message, the exposed code groups were punched by hand onto IBM cards, logged, and physically sorted. The meanings of deciphered code groups were likewise recorded. Each partially decoded message was transcribed onto index cards with key information highlighted. Multiple copies of these cards were filed according to the emphasized details, allowing cryptanalysts to retrieve related material when new messages appeared. The more messages intercepted and processed, the richer the database became, and the easier it was to spot recurring code groups or patterns. However, the popular notion that American cryptanalysts eventually broke the code and could read Japanese messages in full is a misconception. The original JN-25 operational code, introduced in June 1939, was vastly more sophisticated than its predecessors. It took over a year of painstaking effort before analysts could extract any meaningful fragments. By November 1940, they were finally teasing out coherent words and phrases from intercepted traffic. But their progress was short-lived. In December 1940, the Japanese introduced a revised system, designated JN-25A, which immediately invalidated months of accumulated work and forced the Americans to begin again almost from scratch. The progress of U.S. cryptanalysts stalled once the Japanese introduced the revised code. They were unable to make any headway in deciphering it until late 1941. By December of that year, American analysts had managed to decode less than 10% of the Japanese code groups. Messages that didn't include any of the known groups remained completely unintelligible. This meant that in the critical months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. naval intelligence was limited to traffic analysis and direction finding, methods that revealed movement and activity but not intentions or detailed plans. Then, on December 4th, 1941, just 3 days before the attack, the Japanese complicated matters further by introducing yet another revision of JN-25. As the carrier strike force steamed toward Hawaii, the Americans' partial progress vanished. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy overhauled its code-breaking operations. Joseph Rochefort's unit at Pearl Harbor was appointed the lead center for the JN-25B effort. Before this, Rochefort's team had been focused on other Japanese codes, while stations in Washington, D.C. and the Philippines worked independently on. Although U.S. cryptanalysts had uncovered the structure of JN-25 and deciphered several thousand code groups, they were still unable to fully interpret most intercepted Japanese messages. The stunning speed and scale of Japan's early victories left Rochefort and his team reeling, but also more determined than ever. Working in coordination with Washington and Cavite, they redoubled their efforts to break into JN-25 by April 1942, just a month before the Battle of the Coral Sea and 2 months before Midway. Rochefort's cryptanalysts had managed to decrypt roughly one-fifth of the code groups in the JN-25B system. That partial progress proved to be enough. Through a painstaking combination of traffic analysis, direction finding, fragments of decrypted message traffic, and their deep understanding of Japanese language, military culture, capabilities, and strategic behavior, the Americans began to piece together the outlines of Japan's next moves. Their work first revealed critical information about Japan's planned assault on Port Moresby, and, more significantly, exposed the preparations for a much larger operation. That operation, they soon realized, was aimed squarely at Midway. Traffic analysis and direction-finding data helped identify and locate Japanese naval units, confirming the target and timeline of the coming attack. As Rochefort's team dug deeper into JN-25, cryptanalysis began to yield tantalizing fragments, movement orders, supply requests, casualty reports, and other operational messages. Linguists and intelligence analysts pored over every partial decrypt, connecting the dots and filling in the gaps with disciplined precision and well-informed intuition. Rochefort, in particular, possessed a rare instinct for interpreting the faintest hints buried in the code traffic. Pacific Fleet Intelligence Chief Edwin Layton would later credit him with an almost uncanny ability to take fragments of seemingly unrelated information from half-deciphered enemy messages and weave them into an accurate picture of Japanese intentions. This gift, Layton argued, was instrumental in the U.S. victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea. That success also bolstered Admiral Chester Nimitz's confidence in the growing field of radio intelligence. Even as the Coral Sea battle raged, Rochefort's team continued their relentless work, racing to uncover details of Japan's next major operation. By mid-May 1942, they had succeeded in deciphering roughly 40% of the JN-25 code groups, a breakthrough that dramatically expanded what they could read and interpret. Ship movements, supply allocations, and logistical preparations pointing toward a major offensive. Yet the intended target remained cloaked beneath the code name AF. At first, Rochefort and his analysts could only infer that AF referred to a location of strategic value somewhere in the Central Pacific. Other designations, such as AO and AJ, had already been identified as points in the Aleutian Islands, where Japanese activity was also increasing. The question gnawed at them. Was AF another target in the Aleutians or something far more vital? Each fragment added a sliver of insight. Messages referencing long-range reconnaissance flights, requests for weather reports, and the movement of carrier strike groups all pointed south, not north. The analysts at Station HYPO, Rochefort's Pearl Harbor unit, became increasingly convinced that AF was none other than Midway Atoll, the small but strategically pivotal U.S. outpost guarding the approaches to Hawaii. Still, Washington's intelligence officers remained skeptical. The evidence, they argued, was circumstantial. Rochefort decided to settle the matter with a bold test. He proposed that Midway transmit an uncoded radio message reporting a failure in its freshwater distillation system, something mundane but believable. 2 days later, Japanese operators were heard sending a coded message stating that AF is short of water. The confirmation was absolute. F was Midway. From that point forward, Nimitz knew exactly where and when Japan would strike. Every intercepted message, every clue extracted from JN-25 now fell neatly into place. The Americans would be ready, waiting in ambush for the most powerful fleet in the history of the Imperial Navy. Were gathering at Japan's home waters under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's command. Their mission, Rochefort concluded, was to strike Midway in a coordinated assault designed to lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into battle. The pattern was unmistakable. The Japanese were preparing a two-pronged offensive, a diversionary attack in the Aleutians, and a main assault on Midway. Messages referenced occupation force units, the transport of construction materials, and the presence of specialized landing craft, all hallmarks of an amphibious invasion. At the same time, other intercepts pointed to the concentration of the Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier strike force, suggesting that the Midway operation was intended not merely to capture an island, but to annihilate the American. Carriers Rochefort's decrypted fragments, and analytic deductions began to coalesce into a coherent picture. By May 20th, 1942, his team had estimated the Japanese would launch their attack in the first week of June. They even pinpointed the sequence of operations, a preliminary carrier strike to neutralize Midway's defenses, followed by a landing and occupation. This intelligence reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, who grasped its significance immediately. He now possessed a priceless advantage, foreknowledge. Armed with the knowledge that Midway was the target and that the enemy would arrive in early June, Nimitz began orchestrating a plan that would transform the tide of the Pacific War. He recalled his two operational carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet from the South Pacific, and rushed to repair the battered USS Yorktown, still reeling from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Against all odds, Navy shipyard crews at Pearl Harbor restored the Yorktown to fighting condition in just 72 hours. By the end of May, Nimitz's trap was set. His three carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lay in wait northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance. The stage was now prepared for the confrontation that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The crucial detail they needed: the exact date of the impending attack. For days, Rochefort's analysts pored over columns of numbers, scrutinizing every fragment for overlooked clues. Then, amid the haze of partially decrypted code groups, a breakthrough emerged. One message, seemingly mundane, contained a reference to AF, the Japanese code designator that Rochefort's team believed represented Midway. Alongside it appeared a notation that translated to AF will be attacked on or after the 6th. It was the missing piece. The operation against Midway was scheduled to begin on June 4th, 1942. Tokyo time. With that, Rochefort could finally present Admiral Nimitz not just the enemy's target, but the precise timing of the strike. Yet, despite Rochefort's growing confidence, skeptics in Washington, particularly within the Office of Naval Communications, remained unconvinced that AF truly referred to Midway. Some believed it might stand for another Pacific base, perhaps in the Aleutians. Nimitz, however, trusted Rochefort's instincts, but wanted irrefutable proof before committing his fleet to battle. Rochefort devised a clever test. Acting on his suggestion, Midway sent out an uncoded radio message reporting that its freshwater condenser had broken down, leaving the atoll short on drinking water. The Japanese, unaware that the Americans were listening, quickly transmitted a coded message to their fleet. AF is short on water. That transmission removed all doubt. AF was indeed Midway. With the target and timing now confirmed, Nimitz finalized his deployment orders. He directed Task Force 16, comprising Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17, centered on Yorktown, to rendezvous northeast of Midway. There, hidden beyond the horizon, they would lie in wait for Nagumo's strike force. The trap was ready. The Japanese, confident in their secrecy and superiority, were sailing directly into it. The battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific was only days away. Final script. Rewrite. On May 25th, American cryptanalysts unearthed a breakthrough, a partially decrypted message containing the code groups for Midway and attack, accompanied by a date-time group encrypted with an unusually complex method that Navy codebreakers had not yet mastered. Working tirelessly through the night, Joseph Finnegan and Wesley Wright, two of Rochefort's top cryptanalysts, managed to reconstruct the structure of the Japanese encryption table used for the date-time group. Their determination paid off. The decoded result revealed that the attack on Midway was planned for June 4th, while a simultaneous strike on the Aleutian Islands would occur on June 3rd. This was the decisive clue the U.S. Navy needed. Now armed with both the target and the timetable, Admiral Nimitz positioned his available firepower, the undamaged carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with the hastily repaired Yorktown, northwest of Midway, ready to launch a surprise counterattack the moment the Japanese fleet was sighted. By the evening of June 4th, 1942, successive waves of American carrier aircraft had obliterated all four of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Battle of Midway had been won. This stunning victory, a turning point in the Pacific War, would not have been possible without the tireless efforts of Rochefort and his radio intelligence teams, whose quiet brilliance and perseverance cracked the code that changed the course of history. As Rochefort later reflected with characteristic modesty, we felt that we had earned our pay. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and join us next time as we explore more stories from history's hidden battles of the mind. Write them out. Align them many different ways. Look for repeated number sequences. When repeats occur at the same column positions, suspect a depth, same additive used. Subtract to cancel additive and get relations. Hypothesize additive or code group values. Subtract and run checksum tests, e.g., divisible by 3. If tests pass, attempt to match numeric groups to likely words, cribs, using operational knowledge. Confirm via consistency across other messages. Then iterate and expand the partial codebook.